So good afternoon, welcome. We had a great lunch and great presentations regarding this issue of housing, health, and transportation is what we're going to talk about now. So I'm glad you all are here. My name is Carla Gaines. I will be your moderator for today. I work for Quartz Health Solutions, which is a health insurance company. We serve about 335,000 members across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. But specifically, I manage our Badger Care Plus population, and we have approximately 38,000 members in 17 counties of Wisconsin. I've been working with Medicaid for the past 25 years. I work for the poor and underserved, the most vulnerable people and the most important people to me in the issue of health and connecting all those pieces together. So today, this afternoon, I'm going to make sure you're in the right session. We're going to talk about transportation is key, building sustainable and racially equitable communities. And so today we have Steve Steinhoff and Bill Schaefer, and we have Philip Christmacher Jr. And they will introduce themselves and tell a little bit about themselves, and then we'll go right into their presentations. Again, thank you so much for coming, and I'm looking forward to a great session.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you. My name is Steve Steinhoff. I'm the agency director of the Capital Area Regional Planning Commission, which I'm sure you all know all about. We are a small independent unit of government, one of 9 ART regional planning commissions or RPCs around the state that work with local communities to do planning for growth, and we also focus on planning for water quality and environmental resources as well. But we do work in the area of housing. And so I was asked, the topic of this is affordable housing, equity, and transportation, and I was asked to sort of set the stage, provide some context, and really historical context. So how many of you were in the morning session, the racial equity track session? A lot, okay. Well, you'll see some material that's very familiar that Theola presented that I will cover as well. Let's see, does this advance it, or do I have to? What's that?
It's on the side, is it front? It's on the, yeah.
I just have to press?
No, it's either
This?
Yeah. That or the other. Oh, maybe your finger's not connected. And I wasn't the IT person. Somebody else did it for me.
Let's see. Well, maybe I can just scooch this over and I can advance them like that, right? Okay, great.
We need me to help you.
All right, I appreciate it. I think as long as you don't mind me doing this the whole time. So as I said, I'm going to present a lot of the same material as Theola, except less engaging in a more boring way, because that's just the reality of it. Nothing I can do about that. So as was discussed earlier in the previous session, since for much of the 20th century, laws, policies, actions, biases resulted in strict racial segregation. And this is just a quote that demonstrates in small way federal housing policy, which is if a neighborhood is to remain stable, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same racial and social classes. Changes in social and racial occupancy contribute to neighborhood instability and the decline of value levels. So that was enshrined in federal policy and carried out through state and private lending practices as well. So Theola talked about redlining. People generally sort of understood what redlining is, essentially drawing lines on a map to say which areas are considered desirable, the blue and the green, and at the other end, which areas are high risk or hazardous, which is typically where African Americans lived. And those areas essentially were off limit to to loans and from banks and other services, as was talked about. In addition, the areas mostly outside of the red, as Theola also covered, were essentially off-limit for African Americans and persons of color to move into because of the racial covenants and other laws and policies that were in place. And you saw this map earlier also that was presented. The point is that there's some similarities to the previous map and this map to show that that history shapes our current reality today. So some of the red areas that were on that map in South Madison are high concentrations of persons of color today. A 2018 study found that all the red areas in the country, 74% today are still low income, and 2/3 of them are still primarily persons of color. There are some other areas that were concentrated with persons of color that were particularly in African American and Latinx, sort of along the South Beltline, that developed after that Homeowners Loan Corporation map that became affordable over time, and in part more affordable than the areas that were marked desirable, which appreciated in value faster. I'm gonna skip around a few slides. You'll see me skipping past some slides. Don't worry about it. Some of them, as I thought about the presentation more, I rearranged it in my mind. So, so here's another sort of way of slicing this, and I mentioned, it was mentioned in that last session, that's geography of opportunity work that the Regional Planning Commission produced in 2013, where we looked at what we identified as barriers to opportunity. Those are some high poverty rates, high housing cost burdens, lack of access to a car, high levels of lack of English proficiency. There were 10 of them in total. And then we mapped where there were high concentrations of those 10 barriers. And you can see in the red, 7 to 8 were present, and in the orange, 5 to 6. Again, similar correlation with the maps and the maps you saw earlier. I think this is an important point I also wanted to stress, which is that this history this history of discrimination is a key driver of the wealth gap between African Americans and whites, and other Latinx and whites as well. So you see on this chart, the blue line is tracking the average wealth for white families over a period of from 84 to 2009, and the red line is tracking average wealth for African American families. And you can see that gap steadily widening, and that by the most recent data there is 10 times as large wealth gap, and that current data or most recent data of 2016 is pretty much the same, and the same gap exists between white and Latinx. And this study looked at what are the factors, analyze the factors that contribute to this wealth gap. And I think it's just worth reading to say the number of years of home ownership was the largest predictor of the racial wealth gap, larger than any other factor, including income, unemployment, education, and inheritance. So, I mean, I think that's a pretty powerful statement. And when I was giving this presentation a while ago to another audience that, and Chancellor Blank was, part of the moderator. She said, wait, stop. I want you to read that sentence again, because I think, it's pretty impactful. And so what this basically is saying is that the earlier entry access to those New Deal programs that allowed white families to move into suburbia, purchase homes in these areas that was denied to persons of color, gave them an early start in building up this equity. This was one of the most, largest programs of the type in our country for entering the middle class and building wealth that was essentially only available to whites. And you can see over time the result of that. So I'm going to try to bring this back to the present day. Also, I'm going to skip past. And transition to the next speaker. So how does this history relate to our present day reality? And because the topic is about transportation and how low wage workers can get to jobs, we did an analysis. Kurt Paulson, you heard him talk, and in his housing needs assessment, he looked at the 25 occupations in Dane County with the lowest wage occupations that also employed 1,000 or more people. That's 82,000 workers in Dane County with an average wage of 26,600 each. So we looked at those workers and said, well, where could they afford to rent or to own? So we thought, well, let's take just for the sake of mapping, let's take a two-worker household. So that's about $55,000 a year. The areas in tan are the areas where they could afford to purchase a home, and the hashed areas are those where they could afford to rent. And the blue dots show the job centers. The larger dots are more workers, so the largest dot is 5,000 or more workers. The smallest one is less than 500. So what you could see a couple things off the bat. One is that for the most part, workers that our hypothetical household could not really afford to buy a home in very many places in Dane County, and it's particularly not where for the most part where the job centers are. They're going to either live in be able to buy on the south side or the northeast side, or move out to the edges of Dane County. Secondly, you can see that most of the job centers are in places where where this household could afford. They would have about $1,380 a month available for housing, so where they could afford to rent. But I want to put a couple of caveats. I think this, we're still playing with this data, and we're going to try to make it available online on an interactive format. But I think it maybe presents an overly rosy picture because, for one thing, we're looking at that two-household $55,000 income, which is larger than a lot of households. When I said to my mapper, well, run it if there's just a single worker at 26.6, then he did, and then oh, it's all blank. No hash marks, no tan anywhere. So that gives you sort of the other end of the spectrum. But also, just because somebody might live in one of those zip codes with a big blue dot, doesn't mean that if they don't have a car, they can easily access those employment centers. Those are typically not designed for easy access unless you have a car. Epic or the Fitchburg Center or the Middleton Madison West Center or American Center or the Sun Prairie. You can live a mile away and still not be able to get there very easily. And so that points out the need for a broader range of, it's not just transit. There's other pedestrian and walkability methods that are important to that too. And that's why I'm going to turn it over to Bill to give a broader picture of more of those types of transportation options. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So my name is Bill Schaefer. I'm the director/planning manager for the Madison Area Transportation Planning Board, which is kind of the counterpart to Steve's agency. We do regional transportation planning, and we also fund projects, approve funding for projects, and have some funding that we get and select projects for. So that's what people are much more interested in than our planning, but they go hand in hand. So, Steve started the conversation, but, the reason why the location of affordable housing is so important is that when households are forced to live in less central, less walkable, less transit accessible, more auto-dependent neighborhoods due to housing costs, their transportation costs rise accordingly, often to the point where the combined housing and transportation costs are not affordable for the household. And that's why this issue is so important. The charts, this is national data, a little bit dated, but kind of illustrates the point on the left. A transit-rich neighborhood for an average household. This isn't a low-income household. This is an average household. Transportation makes up a smaller percent of their overall household budget versus on the right in a more auto-dependent area, on average, about 25%. And for low-income families, the percent of their household budget spent on transportation can be, 50% or even a little more because, it costs a lot to own and operate a car and drive it long distances. So put this up here just to kind of remind you that, it's important to keep in mind that all trips begin and end as pedestrians, even if you're, walking from your car to the building. And so it's important that we have in our communities good pedestrian and bicycle network. The other thing is that there are limited access highways like the Beltline and Verona Road and US Highway 151 that goes through Sun Prairie. And those provide great auto access, but they create barriers for other types of transportation. And there are a number of these neighborhoods in the maps that Steve was showing that are along these limited access roadways and limit options that makes it more difficult to provide to serve, those neighborhoods for, and by other means besides driving. This is just a schematic showing like a walk shed for bus stops, and kind of illustrates the point of kind of the trade-off between, if we have closer space stops, that's great in terms of shortening people's walking distances, but it also lengthens travel times. So there's a trade-off there. This is kind of idealized, showing, quarter mile or 5-minute walk, and we obviously know that, this assumes you can get directly from your house to the stop, and that isn't often the case. And these two maps kind of illustrate that. So this is showing actually a half-mile or 10-minute walk from proposed bus rapid transit stops. And so you can see there on the left, along Odana Road, that stop, because of the Beltline, that limits the walk shed for that stop, as well as the limited street connectivity in the UW Research Park there. So it really hampers the ability to access that stop versus the one on the right along East Washington Avenue, much fuller walk shed because of that, because you don't have those barriers. So it kind of illustrates that point. So Steve mentioned, he had a slide there showing with dots employment centers. This is a employment density map showing jobs per acre, and again pointing out most of the jobs are in the central part of the county. No surprise to all of you. But the other thing that's noticeable, I think, is how many of these job centers are along these limited access roadways. Again, great for auto access if you have a car, but makes it difficult to serve these neighborhoods by transit. And the fact that these office parks or business parks have kind of a limited curvilinear street network, not a good grid, again, makes it difficult to serve, to get access by walking or biking as well as by transit. So this is a accessibility map for pedestrians, and this shows this is basically access. How many destinations can you access walking from these areas? And so dark blue and dark green areas have higher pedestrian access scores, and yellow lower access. And again, it's just, the important thing here is that not all communities have transit. Many of the trips that people make are 2 to 3 miles or less in distance, and so that walking, biking network is really important. And the more affordable housing that we can locate in these areas with high walk accessibility, the better. The areas are obviously central area, but then the downtowns of suburban communities and some other mixed-use centers, and that's certainly part of City of Madison's land use policy, many other communities, to try to recreate some of the centers that we do have, make them more mixed-use, pedestrian friendly. This is a map that shows transit accessibility. So this shows the percent of jobs in the metro area that can be reached within a 45-minute bus ride during the AM peak period. So again, darker green, higher accessibility. And one of the things you can see from this is that there are a number of high poverty areas that are in the red here along the periphery that have very low transit accessibility to jobs. Makes it very, very difficult for them, obviously, if they don't have a car. So this is a map. Ignore the label's a little bit confusing. This is census data, but this shows where people live who are working in this dark, bold, black shaded area. So for people that work in that area, where do they live? And one of the things you can see, it's fairly dispersed as you would expect in terms of where people are coming from that work to those locations. And the only jobs that are included here are jobs that are $40,000 a year or less. So, moderate to low income jobs. You do see a concentration of people living right within that same area, perhaps in part because difficult to get there if you don't have a car. So that's kind of just one real world example. And then this is a similar map showing where people live who work in the Westtown area. Again, shown in the bolded area. And so again, an example, you can see a fair amount of people living fairly close to where they work there. For example, if you're living on the south side, in that other smaller green circle here, need to get there to work. How do you do that? And so went to Google Maps, and this is the result. So in this upper map, you can see that by car, and this is at 10 a.m. in the morning, which is when the mall opens. Going by car via the Beltline, no sweat, 10 to 15 minute drive. By bus, in this one, you're looking at about an hour bus ride. And part of this is because our bus network, the service levels are so much higher during that peak period. Once you get to the mid-morning, where some of these low-income jobs, then the service drops off, requires more transfers, service isn't as frequent, so 4 times as long to get there by bus. And then this one shows bike about 45 minutes. So it kind of just illustrates the difficulty of serving these cross-town type of trips, which low-income people tend to be making. Not as many of them are working in the downtown area where our bus system is focused because there's more riders to those areas. So it kind of illustrates real-world example of those challenges. So here's just a kind of a list of transportation solutions to connecting affordable housing and jobs. Obviously, the more housing of this type that we can locate in areas that are close to jobs, have really good transit access, walkable, that's great. But what can we do, on the transportation side to connect people to jobs? And I'll talk about a few of these in my final slides, a little more detail, but first two, is just expanding bus service. Expanding bus service to more communities. Philip's going to talk about Sun Prairie's new service to downtown campus, or hours of operation, improving service in those off-peak periods, and then reducing crosstown ride times. And that's one of the things that Bus Rapid Transit that is being planned. That's one of the purposes of that, is to improve that. Mayor Rhodes Conway came out with this Metro Forward initiative, which includes the Bus Rapid Transit, but also includes some other things, including stated goal of improving service to the south side as well, which isn't on the initial BRT line. Talked about improving walking and bicycling connections. Demand responsive transit, so some areas bus transit isn't feasible. There's just not a density of population and jobs to be able to do that, so there's other transit service models out there. Employer-sponsored van pools, you heard about that at lunchtime, an example of that. Shared mobility services, taxis, or transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. Those are much less affordable, but is an option, at least in emergency cases. There are some employment transportation services, including the one that YWCA operates, the YW Job Ride Program. And then we have a program as well called Rideshare, et cetera, that I will talk about a little bit. So again, complete streets, just that is part of it. You know, the more places that you can walk to meet everyday needs, the less you're going to need a car for every person of driving age in your household. So that is important, and there are a lot of trips that can be done that way. So demand responsive transit, so this includes everything other than a bus operating on a route and going the same route and operating and stopping at the same stops. The two alternatives, one of them is just a taxi system like City of Sun Prairie, City of Stoughton have, completely demand responsive. This is another example. This is from Denver, which operates the largest, what they call flex route or flex ride service in the country, where the bus has set time points that they stop at, and you can go to a time point and get to catch the bus there. But you can also, basically request a ride and get picked up somewhere else in between those stops. So it's kind of a hybrid, and this is the type of service that might work for some areas, either to connect people to the bus system or to circulate, shorter distance trips like within their own community, rather than say getting from, suburban community into downtown. For instance, the disadvantage is the cost per ride is a lot higher than a bus. I mean, in this case, it's about $22 per trip, while people are paying, a $2.50 fare. So subsidy is a lot greater because, you've got fewer people, riding on the bus per trip. There are all these, what we call shared mobility services, some that we have here, some that we may be getting in the future. This includes everything from, traditional shared ride services, which is, van pool program, including the state-operated van pool program, to other newer services like the bike share, car share, perhaps in the future scooter sharing, as well as these van pools. This Zerology is a brand new startup company, just found out about, that is planning to do, provide car sharing service, and it's using electric vehicles, which is great. That's not necessarily affordable, but one of the things that they are, part of their business model is to provide vehicles for employers for van pool programs, which might be a benefit to folks. It allows employers to not have to deal with the hassle of buying and owning and operating a vehicle. So that's one of their business models. And then finally, our agency operates a program that assists commuters to connecting them to alternative transportation to, primarily to get to work, but for other purposes as well. We also assist businesses with setting up programs for their transportation programs for their employees, and so we're definitely a resource. One of the programs, one of the amenities is that for people that sign up to the program, there's this guaranteed ride home program where if you normally take the bus or bike, carpool to your job, but you need to go home in an emergency, your child's sick or whatever, you can get a free taxi ride home. And it's part of the program. Dane County actually, we administer the program. Dane County supports the vouchers for the taxi ride. So resource that is available for both individual commuters as well as companies. So that's it for me. I'm going to set it up for have Philip come up and talk about their experience getting transit service going in the city. And while he's introducing himself, I'll see if I can get your presentation set up, and then we'll take questions after that. Yeah, I think it's right.
Oh, okay. All right, good afternoon. My name is Philip Gritzmacher. I'm a city planner with the City of Sun Prairie. And I'm going to talk with you a little bit about our the expansion of Metro Transit into the City of Sun Prairie. Many of you probably know that Sun Prairie recently it was expanded, the Metro Transit recently expanded into Sun Prairie. It's been a really fun and rewarding experience to be a part of, so happy to share this with you. So for many years, when people thought of transportation in Sun Prairie, this is what you think of. It's the collection of highways, arterials, collectors, and local roads that comprise the roadway network. And with that, people would also think about the shared ride taxi in the background as something that could be utilized. Yeah, they do go to Easttown as well. But in reality, people need a variety of modes to get around, either by choice or by need due to their financial resources or mobility limitations. And this is really reinforced when you look at county data. What you see is a little over 70% of people drive to work, and everyone else is finding different methods of getting around. And out of curiosity in this room, to get to, well, not work today, but to the conference, how many people drove here? So I see some people in the room that didn't.
We work across the street.
That's perfect. Okay, fair enough. But in the county, what you see is that, about 30% of the people who are commuting to work aren't driving. They're telecommuting, they're carpooling, they're taking transit, they're walking, they're biking. So as a city, we can't just focus on automobiles. We need to think about all modes of transportation. When you look at the data, it really reinforces that. So this is a map showing where Sun Prairie residents work. And what you see is that there's a number of residents that work in Sun Prairie, but there's also a number of residents that are working throughout the region, whether that's downtown Madison, Easttown Mall, MATC, the UW Hospital, even as far out as Fitchburg and Middleton. Flipping it, where do people who work in Sun Prairie live? A lot of people who work in Sun Prairie live in Sun Prairie, but a lot of people who work in Sun Prairie live elsewhere. And we know that this is something that distance might not be a problem if you have easy access to an automobile, but if you don't, due to any of the reasons that I outlined before, this commute could be problematic for you, or if it isn't now, it could become problematic in the future. So those options are really important. And that's why Sun Prairie is planning a multimodal transportation network that has regional connectivity. So the part that you're interested in today is fixed route transit service. How did we get the bus into Sun Prairie? And we can't really talk about that without talking about where we've been. So for years we've had a shared ride taxi that provided great accessibility within the city. You could call it up, it will pick you up at your house and drop you off right in front of your destination, offering door-through-door service for those who need it. It's a type of service that if you go to the grocery store and you need help loading your groceries into the taxi, they'll do that, and they'll help bring those groceries into your house for you. But there are problems with a service like this in terms of reliability. It is demand responsive, so when you have a great number of people using the service, the delays and waits can add up. And for someone who is transit dependent, this can be particularly problematic when you're getting to a job that requires you to be there at a very strict start time, as is common with many people that are of lower income levels. And the other problem with this is the cost structure. It's $4 a trip each way. And then as you start moving outside of the community, the first mile, it's another $2.25 and $2.25 for each mile after that. And our boundary ends at the interstate. There is a $5 fare to Easttown Mall, should you need to go there. So it does some things really well and some things not so well. So because of this, the city has been discussing transit for years. So I started this timeline in 2016, but really you could start this timeline in 2008 or 2009, the first time that fixed route transit was ever mentioned in one of the city's comprehensive plans. But I'm starting it here because this is where the ball really started rolling. So in 2016, the city held the Sun Prairie Transportation Summit, which was a place for citizens and officials to get together and talk about the different transportation issues facing Sun Prairie. And because of that, as a result of that, the city decided to form an ad hoc steering committee on transportation. The purpose of that committee was to actually come up with the solutions to the transportation problems that were discussed as a part of that summit. So this committee got together and met on a number of occasions and discussed all modes of transportation, offered up solutions across modes. And specific to transit, they recommended exploring fixed route local transit service and express service into the Madison area. So fast forward to 2018, and the Transit Commission is reaching out to Metro Transit and the Madison Area Transportation Planning Board, which Bill's the director of, to ask what is the best first step for Sun Prairie into transit, and create some recommendations and some draft routes. You know, as the community is coming to transit for the first time, we don't know where to begin. So the MPO and Metro Transit said that the very first option to consider would be commuter bus service, something that is going to be successful off the bat, that's going to build goodwill within the community in terms of transit service, demonstrate that transit is feasible within the community, and begin to provide some of those transit benefits, and to ground truth that by actually surveying residents and seeing if this was something that they wanted. So the city reached out to WSDOT and got a grant to conduct a scientific survey of residents, and conducted this in the middle of last year. And as the results were coming in of this survey, we received a contact from Metro saying that they had a few buses that were coming available if the city of Sun Prairie was interested in those buses. And the timing was really good because we had our survey results where almost 50% of the people said they have some interest in this commuter bus service. They provided destinations that they'd like to reach and the mode that they'd like to use to get there. Most people wanted to either walk to the service or drive to the service via park and ride. What you saw is that 80% of the people who are currently using, or who would use this service, are currently driving alone to get to work. And other people are finding creative solutions that are potentially very challenging. So the city staff brought this information to the council, and the council jumped on it. There was the groundwork that had been laid over a number of years to get the ball rolling, and they added this to the budget. And at the same time, the Transit Commission instructed city staff to start pursuing a park and ride. So that brings us to this year. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that we did. I don't expect you to read any of this. I just wanted to demonstrate, wow, a lot of stuff happened. It happened in sequence, and it's been a learning experience for all of us all the way down the line. So I'm going to highlight a couple things on here that were the most significant. And if you really want to read through this, I'm happy to email it to you. One of the most important things was a route analysis. One of the things that working with Metro and the MPO that we realized is that the route was likely to take 31 minutes from Sun Prairie to downtown Madison. And that's significant for a couple of reasons. And it really comes down to the way that we want the service to operate. At 31 minutes, the service is either going to operate at a weird interval, like every 40 minutes the bus will be in Sun Prairie, or it'll sit somewhere, dwell somewhere for a long time. And that service that the city's still paying for. The bus is sitting there for 25 minutes waiting to begin the next trip. Or the city could utilize that time and provide access to people who potentially would like to walk to the service, need to walk to the service, and provide an added benefit of allowing Madison residents the ability to access their jobs in Sun Prairie. So we looked at a number of different routes, and we looked at a variety of metrics, including density, but not just density, not just dots on a map. Looking at the ground, you see that there are areas that appear to be very dense. In some of those areas, there are fences separating the houses from the road, so it's very difficult to access that particular road by walking. We also looked at income. This is census data, so unfortunately it's at the tract level, which means that you just kind of see the center of the community lighting up. As far as where low-income populations live. We also looked at we looked at where concentrations of minority residents lived, and we're interested in seeing that it's not necessarily where the low-income residents live, but in many cases it is. And we use this information along with a variety of other information to come up with a route that we thought was the best first step into transit. And this doesn't go very far into Sun Prairie, but what it does do is provide great access to jobs at a job center that has been requesting employees It offers the most households per mile and ensures that the trips will be on time and reliable, demonstrating to the community that transit can succeed in Sun Prairie, hopefully building goodwill for further expansion in the future. So we took this route, backing up, one of the other great things about this particular route is that there was a CDA-owned parcel of land within close proximity to this route for a park and ride. And that's really critical for a number of reasons. If you don't live along this route, but you have the ability to get to the park and ride either by someone dropping you off or taking the shared ride taxi, it means that you have the fastest trip into Madison from that particular spot because that's the last stop on the route. And with this land already being available to the city at no charge, it made it more feasible for this to be something that would be possible quickly. So we took this recommendation to the public. We had meetings, we had people would email in, they would talk to us on the phone, and we asked for their feedback. What do they think of the route? What do they think about the idea? We heard a number of things. This is at Creekside Elementary School in the Smiths Crossing neighborhood. There were concerns about equity, that the route wasn't reaching the populations that needed it the most. There were concerns about crime, garbage, that the neighborhood wouldn't use it, that the buses would be noisy, and that the stop locations were directly in front of houses. So kind of some of the same things you hear no matter where you implement transit. But as is being the first step into the community, it's certainly something that is very important to address. So we did our best to address all of these needs at the meeting and these questions, and in some cases modified the route and the stop time, the route times and the stop locations to address those concerns. And we presented that route to the city council and it was approved. At the same time, we presented the design for the park and ride, which was approved. So this is this summer. They're grading the park and ride lot after the design was approved, and we had a contractor on board. And at the same time that we were building the park and ride, we were having a marketing blitz. Sandy back there, who I work with, helped out a lot with this, as did Metro Transit. Metro had advertisements on the back of their buses. We were able to get a electronic billboard on the side of 151 advertising. And then we had Metro brought out buses to the Sweet Corn Fest and National Night Out, allowing people to get on the bus, learn how to put a bike on the bus, and get just generally more comfortable with the bus. And we had flyers that we gave to our elected officials as well. And that brings us to service opening. So this is day one, the very first rider at the park and ride, and we were happy to see that there were already people on the bus as it pulled up to the park and ride. And this gentleman was actually loading a bike onto the bus. Since this day, service has been growing each week. That brought us to the fun part of celebrating, where the officials from Madison Metro, the city of Madison, and Sun Prairie got together and celebrate the relationship and open the park and ride officially, but that wasn't the end of what is happening with transit. We still have a number of finishing touches that we hadn't fully thought about when this process began, and such as boarding pads that need to go in place to make all of these stops ADA accessible. So there are a number of these things that you have to think about when you're putting these types of services in. So the interesting part that you guys are probably all wondering about, how's it doing? Most days now, when this has been operating about a month and a half, we're seeing a lot at 35 to 45% occupancy. We're even seeing people out there on the weekends when we don't have service. We're seeing about 100 rides per day. And employers in Sun Prairie and residents have all provided positive feedback. We haven't received complaints about garbage or crime or some of the concerns that came up. What we've heard is that people are taking the bus to get to work, and that they would really like to see this expanded in either in hours or in scope or onto the weekends. I had one employer actually come up to me and say that even though the service doesn't reach them, it gave an employee the opportunity to get to work using the bus and a bike. They were able to combine those modes. So what's the future of transit in Sun Prairie? Well, the next thing we need to do to improve accessibility and equity of the service is figure out a way to link our shared ride taxi to this commuter bus service, allow people to have a seamless transition between the two, a fare-free transfer. Long-term, it's going to be figuring out exactly how we have local bus service and using this express commuter bus service as the launching point for that. And that's really going to be something that we are planning for over the next number of years, and we're excited to do so because we're demonstrating right now that transit is successful in Sun Prairie. So, appreciate the time. Thank you.
So, thank our panel for a great discussion. It is clear that transportation, housing, wage, employment, health kind of all combined in this issue, and what we're going to do about it. And so I have a quick question before we open it up to our attendees. In those areas, I don't know if this is a Steve or Bill question, but what were the large dots? What were some of those employers in those large dot areas?
They were, well, there's downtown Madison, the UW, and then Epic Systems. You have the Fitchburg Employment Center. You have Middleton Business Park. You have American Center on the northeast side, and then I think those are most of them.
Okay, just thinking about,
Those were centers, not individual.
Okay.
Necessarily individual.
Other than Epic,
Yes.
there are collections of employers.
yes, and just thinking about those employees that are of low income are probably not accessing those jobs.
It's difficult
Yes.
if they don't have good car.
Right,
access,
right, and the repair for the car and all those things that come with the car.
Right.
And my other piece was you all talked about walking and bikes, and for low-income families and individuals, that seems to be challenging, at least for my Medicaid families that I work with. I don't think many of them have bikes. So I think those are some challenges that we as a community need to also kind of address. Or do you have any possibilities of an answer?
I mean, I agree with you that especially in terms of bicycling, and I don't know if it's a cultural thing or what, but you do see, I mean, you don't see the number of bicyclists for, particularly minorities, Latinx people. So, and that's something that there's been an effort to do, and there's been some projects to kind of, I mean, there are programs to get bicyclists.
Yes, yep.
To get free bikes in people's hands, but also to help people feel more comfortable navigating around on a bike. But it is, I mean, like I say, for trips up to 3 to 5 miles,
Right.
you're on your own schedule. It's very low cost, healthy.
It is,
So
yeah.
it is something we'd like to see more people take advantage, especially with the incredible infrastructure that we have in the Madison area.
Right. So with that, I'll take questions from the audience. Yes.
I was impressed that you talked about the American Center, because that particular area has Oakwood, has the American Insurance Company, American Family, and also the University Hospital that's moved out there. So in that combination, those are shift workers, and so people get off in the middle of the night. And I don't think the bus service is taking care of the third shift worker. So what can be done to expand it to hours rather than just distance?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I think for that third shift, it's almost like you need a special service that's oriented to employees. That's more like a shared, like a small, it's almost like a van pool type size. But it's it's because you're just not going to be able to run buses all hours of night out there. It is frustrating. I mentioned that so many of these employment centers were designed in a way to make it more difficult to serve by regular transit, and I know there's been some talks, some planning undergoing now about kind of redeveloping a little bit of that American Center, adding in some street connections and maybe some other uses, there as well. So, because if you work there, where do you go for lunch? If you don't, especially if you don't have a car, you can get there, things like that. So, but yeah, it requires for that sort of thing, it requires a special service, something other than running buses, till 2 in the morning, which just financially can't do.
Yes.
I live more at the opposite end of the county in Middleton. And I notice that some of the bus files in Middleton especially do not serve my area after certain times of day. Like going up to the square, I cannot catch a direct bus to the square. I can catch a bus near my house up to the square, up to about 1:11 p.m. But the problem is, it's not a direct bus. It has to make a very large loop, and the loop alone is almost 60 minutes. And then by the time it gets to the square, it's close to like an hour and 15 minutes in transit. And I don't know if you've heard any other communities that are kind of like Middleton, voice their opinion about some of the transit bios and stuff like that, because especially like coming home, there's no bus that serves my neighborhood after 6 p.m. So like I have to leave the square generally by 3:30, 4 o'clock to make it home in time. So I still get a bus that's going near my house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a problem. It's one of the things that the bus rapid transit system, even though that's it's an east-west route, it's basically east to west town, but Middleton residents could benefit by that because of you can have service that then connects into the BRT system, which is going to be running every 10, 15 minutes, 15 minutes off peak, and it's more cost efficient to run a route to then connect to the BRT rather than having to run a route with fewer riders that's going all the way to the downtown area. So that connecting service into the BRT system is going to be really important, and that's something that the planning work is really just getting started on in terms of how can we make use of that frequent kind of trunk line service that BRT provides.
Yeah, and then I have another question. Will the BRT service end up costing the average bus passenger more money?
Same
As
fare.
far as fare?
Nope, same fare.
So the
Will be-
fare will be the same?
Fare will be the same and free,
I always-
free transfer.
I
Yep.
remember I lived in a community out east, and if they had express buses, the express buses were almost $1 higher than what they call base fare buses.
Yep, no, the fares will be the same, and I think they are for the Sun Prairie service, right,
Yep.
as well?
Yep, same
Yep,
price.
even though that's a express service.
We are at time, but I will just leave it open for just one more question. If anyone has a dying question.
Dying question, but it's just a comment when you were talking about people riding their bikes. I like to ride my bike, we talk about the comfort. My thing is that there's not enough sufficient, in my opinion, safe bike paths. I mean, I live on the far east side, and to get to that path where there's no cars, I'm gonna be on that street, so I'm not biking across. I don't trust y'all.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
there's a fear factor there when it comes to
Sure.
that. And because I have seen cars do things that I'm like, that's a person on a bike, okay. And I thought to myself, I choose not to be casualty of that car.
True.
Yeah, yeah. That is true, and there is an emphasis nowadays on, now on trying to provide what we call low traffic stress routes. In fact, we have a map, we have a online interactive site where you can go and find a route between 2 points that you would be more comfortable. But I agree, particularly as you get out of the central area, you get in situations where you might have to be on a busy road for a short part of your trip, and most people aren't willing to do that.
Right.
So.
Two more minutes. Philip, I just want to commend Sun Prairie on your initiative and getting started, and hopefully sharing your the project with other communities in the Dane County area, and the success of that, because there is definitely low income housing in Sun Prairie, because my families are moving to Sun Prairie, and so for you all to take that initiative, that's a start. That's a good start. I saw two more questions, right? Yes, and then you will be the final. Oh, okay. Yes.
I would like to know if you are planning these bus routes along areas where there is childcare.
It's a problem. It's definitely an issue. That's where again, the frequency of service is probably more important than anything, because if you've got to stop, you got to stop and drop your child off and then get back on the bus. If you got to wait for another half hour, it is challenging. I mean, it's something that is considered. I don't know if that's something, but it is definitely something we try to do, but definitely recognized as a issue for people with kids in daycare.
Well, I want to thank Steve, Bill, and Philip for awesome panel discussions. We can give them a hand. And what this whole kind of conference kind of tells me is that we have still much work to do. And collectively, with these great minds, much work to do to move our community to a better place of living in equity, and in support, and in fair housing. So thank you all so much for coming. I believe we have a break right now.